Good afternoon and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. I am Massi Bambara, North Bay Market President of Bank of America Merrill Lynch, member of the Commonwealth Club Board of Governors, and your chair for today's program. You can find us on the internet at commonwealthclub.org as well as on Facebook and YouTube. Today we are pleased to present the Walter Hoadley Annual Economic Forecast, named in honor of the club's late past president and longtime board member, Dr. Walter Hoadley. Dr. Hoadley also served most notably as Chief Economist and Vice President of the Bank of America. Today's program is sponsored by the Walter E. Hoadley Memorial Fund and Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Our program will feature two distinguished speakers with distinct viewpoints. Lenny Mendonca, pronounced Chair Emeritus of the Bay Area Council and Bay Area Council Economic Institute, Senior Partner Emeritus, McKinsey & Company, and lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And Dr. John Taylor, Professor and Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and former economic advisor to Presidents Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. Let me say a bit more about each. Lenny Mendonca is a Senior Partner Emeritus from the Washington, D.C. and San Francisco offices of McKinsey & Company, a global management consulting firm. He founded McKinsey's U.S. state and local public sector practice. He is also the chair of both New America and Children Now, co-chair of California Forward, and co-founder and chair of FuseCorp. Mr. Mendonca was also vice chair of the Stanford Graduate School of Business Advisory Council and a trustee at the Committee for Economic Development. He holds an MBA from and is a lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard. He is also a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Dr. John Taylor is the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics and George Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Dr. Taylor was on President Trump's short list to chair the Federal Reserve. His fields of expertise are monetary policy, fiscal policy, and international economics. He previously served as a member of the Congressional Budget Office's panel of economic advisors and as a Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs. He holds a doctorate in economics from Stanford University and a bachelor's in economics from Princeton University. Today, Mr. Mendonca and Dr. Taylor will be in conversation with Dr. Edward Wasserman, Dean of the Journalism School at the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Wasserman holds PhD in media, politics, and economics from the London School of Economics and is the former executive business editor of the Miami Herald. So please now let's welcome Lenny Mendonca, Dr. John Taylor, and Dean Edward Wasserman.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today with my distinguished panelists. I must say, as a Berkeley faculty member, this is quite a lot of Stanford in one sitting. But that's okay. We have enormous respect for our crosstown rival. I want to start with a kind of a big picture question, that a sort of a wide-angle question that some of us is on the minds of some of us. And that has to do with the sort of a fundamental and rather profound division in the current environment. We have, on the one hand, an economy that is buoyant, that is marked by substantial continuing growth, confidence, optimism, and that exists in a parallel universe from a political environment which is marked by disarray, by leadership that doesn't lead, by dismay affecting a substantial number of voters, and yet the economy seems to be chugging along, oblivious to this. And I'm wondering, at how long can that go on, and walk us through what the areas of contact, and at what point will is the economy responding to dog whistle signs from the political leadership the rest of us aren't picking up? Just help us make sense of this apparent incoherence in our social and political environment.
Well, let me start. Thanks for coming. It's great to be back here. I want to say, I was telling Gloria, I like the nickname, the home for ideas here at the Commonwealth Club. So it's great to participate in these discussion of ideas, but also, as Ed points out, implementation of ideas. So I've been worried about the U.S. economy's growing too slow for a while. I've talked about it the last time I was here. This Bay Area is doing great, but if you go Central Valley, it's not so great. You go down Imperial County, it's terrible. And the rest of the country has these pockets which are not doing too well. So I think that has been because our growth rate, well, has been continuing positive since the terrible Great Recession, has been quite low. It's around 2%. So what I think we're seeing now, and I've been hoping this would happen, is a pickup. I almost like to think of this as finally we're having a recovery, or we're starting over again in a recovery which we should have had back in 2009-10, which we never really had. We never had the usual rebound of 5, 6, 7% growth as we had, say, in the 80s, that rebound. But we may be getting it now, and what I've been arguing, and I think this addresses Ed's question, what I've been arguing is we need to have a change in policy. And I've listed, you need to have tax reform, you need to have regulatory reform, you need to have budget reform, and my favorite subject, monetary reform. And so I think there are some changes, at least in two of those. On the tax reform, we've had a big tax act that was passed recently. Firms have been anticipating it, people have been anticipating it. Maybe that's one of the reasons the market it's responding not just to what people say, but what people do in this case. And then also on the regulatory side, quite a few changes, which are kind of in the weeds to see what they are, but there's all over the place, partly the appointments that have been made, partly the actions that have been taken. So it's consistent with what I've said should happen, and it's beginning to happen. Now, it hasn't happened on the budget. It hasn't happened on certain parts of monetary policy. Maybe it'll happen a little bit more there, but it's a start. And I think that's what we're seeing, at least I hope. And if that's the case, we should see a pickup in growth, and we may be seeing already. So all the cacophony that you're referring to, there's a huge division in our country about where we should be going. I hear it every day. Some people think it's because of the social media, splinters people, but it's there. It's remarkable. I think even the debate about the effect of economic policy, I've never seen it so split between one side and another. This tax reform bill, some people vehemently against. How could this be good for America? And I'm more positive about it. Lowering taxes on business from corporations substantially, small businesses as well. That is a change in the international tax system, repatriation at a discount rate. You're reading every day. It's amazing about how many things are happening, not just these bonuses, but actually firms expanding their operations. That's what you'd expect if you lower the tax on investment, which is what that 35 to 21% does. You'd expect to see more, and I think we're beginning to see more. And if we want to make wages higher, we need to have more productivity. Workers have to be producing more per hour, and they do that with better, more capital and more technology. And I think that's what we're trying to do. So let's hope that this is what I say is correct, and that it will tend to bring people, I'd say, back together again, because it's been a split more than I've ever seen before. I mean, I did a letter. It turned out to be a letter to the Wall Street Journal, but it was originally a letter to Secretary Mnuchin, Steve Mnuchin, about why the tax reform would be a good idea. Other people signed it, but they put it as an op-ed. Within hours of it going online, we were getting severe critiques, sometimes personal attacks for this. And I never seen it like this. And of course, we tried to respond, but that's the way it is. Let's hope we can come together on some of those issues more than we have been.
So just to get you back to the original question, are you suggesting that the quality of leadership is actually better than it seems?
Oh, the delivery. Look, the delivery. Let's look on the results. The delivery is what I've been arguing we should have on this same forum, what I think should happen, at least on 2 of the 4 that I mentioned.
Right.
So I'd say you think about the results. That's what all I can do, quite frankly. I've, as you know, served many times in government. I love the idea of going back between the world of ideas and the world of action. I think I benefit in both directions. And things happen in all sorts of different ways. There are these swings on good policy to bad policy in the United States. I don't think it's actually, those swings are much related to political parties. I've criticized, for example, the terrible policy in the 70s. A lot of that began with Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, but it was continuing with later in that decade. Terrible economic performance, low productivity, low growth, and then picked up in the 80s, but it continued in the 90s. So that wasn't just Reagan, it was Clinton, part of that as well. It has not been so good recently. And that's the concern that I think we all should have. Income inequality, low growth, low labor force participation, parts of the country doing particularly bad. And so if we can turn that around, regardless of how it happens, I mean, politics works in funny ways. I think that sometimes they say, you got to get your idea on the shelf. And then at the right time, someone will pick it off and be able to move that. And you don't ever know, you don't know exactly when it'll be. You hope it happens. It might not be the way you want it to have happen, not the ideal way we discuss it together in a seminar, but that's what you want to have happen.
Lenny, let me get you to weigh in on this wide-angle question.
Let me also say that it's a pleasure to be in the Commonwealth Club, particularly in this new facility. For those of you who are here in person, this is just a fantastic place and a great home for honest, fact-based conversation that are done in a respectful way, whether you actually disagree or not, and that's what we intend to do today. So I am particularly honored to be able to share the stage with Dr. Taylor, who I greatly admire, and we probably agree on a large number of aspects, but I'm going to make sure that I highlight the things that I don't agree with him on. So let me start with the things I do agree with. I do think this recent tax
Bill,
okay, will stimulate the economy and will likely see faster growth. That's the end of my productive comments about the tax bill. We have exacerbated the new Gilded Age we're in by passing a bill that had the opportunity to deal with some of the problems that Dr. Taylor mentioned, particularly the issue about differential corporate taxation and the amount of cash that was on companies' balance sheets that will be brought back to the United States. We definitely needed to do that, but we didn't need to do it combined with a massive giveaway to the 1%. Less than a quarter of the gains that come from corporate tax reduction go to workers. The remainder goes to capital. 50% of the capital of the United States is held by 1% of the population. And a third of the capital that's in corporations in the United States is held by foreigners. So if you're surprised that the stock market is going up because of what happened, or you're surprised that people are cheering in Davos for the results of this tax cut, you don't know those facts. Of course it stimulated the economy. Of course it made the stock market go up. But it is going to blow a hole in the deficit for the longer term, and it's going to exacerbate the biggest problem we've got in this country and around the world, which is inequality. We do not have a system that's going to ensure that all of those gains benefit everyone. This tax bill was a missed opportunity to create a new tax regime globally, but have that being reinvested in the United States in a thoughtful way that benefits everyone. As for the disconnect between the markets and popular opinion, that's also not surprising. We measure GDP, we measure the stock market. We have a good sense of the economic issues as we are measured. The Federal Reserve has two objectives: full employment and price stability. Who's measuring or talking about or being held accountable for economic mobility? The only people that are politicians, and it only happens when there's a vote. So democracy is what's holding this in check, and the anger that you're seeing around the country and in the United States is partly partisan garbage driven by and enhanced by social media, but it's actually a real and underlying concern about the economy is not working well for everyone. Historically, democracy has been a great way to help deal with that. If you look back to the progressive era at the turn of the 20th century, I could describe a set of conditions for you that if I told you those were the conditions, you would say, that's today. Wealth is soaring, it's concentrated. There is enormous sense about the frustration with the concentration of power in the small hands of a number of individuals and a number of institutions. Women are taking to the streets in viral protests about their lack of access to opportunity. Citizens are frustrated with corruption in both parties and feeling like there needs to be dramatic change. I just described for you the progressive era 120 years ago. We're in it again. And I think what we're going to have is the scale of that kind of response politically to these challenges economically. I actually think that's constructive. Having a whole new wave of progressive, what I call progressive federalism, thinking about these issues to ensure that the voices of citizens are in this, is a really good idea. The alternative to not having productive democracy is called revolution. I'd like to see that these economic gains that are going to the stock market actually go to everyone.
Let's go back to the tax bill, because that's probably the single most significant indication of what where the political leadership is going with respect to the economy. I want to tease out some more reflections on what you anticipate the tax bill's consequences to be. Let's start with housing, since obviously both the restrictions on deductibility of mortgage, deductibility of local taxes has an impact on housing. Everybody cares about housing prices, either as owners or as would-be buyers. Where do you see that, John, where do you see the consequence on housing as being from the tax bill?
I think it's basically positive, but because most of this tax reform has its impact on business investment, I think that you'll see more of an effect there. And I think that's really what I think is so important to stress in this tax reform is growth. Growth has been low.
So you have no problem characterizing it as a reform? Because Lenny was not stumbling over that.
Reform, definitions of reforms vary, but on the corporate side, we reduced it in a direction that everybody wanted to have happen. Actually, the beginning of last year, through most of this last year, when I talked about tax reform, people would laugh. This is never going to happen. President Obama wanted to have corporate tax reform. He saw this high rate and wanted to do something about it. So it went from 35 to 21. If you were to ask me how can we get wages higher in America, I would say we need to have workers be more productive. That history tells you the United States is a richer country than most countries in Africa because our productivity is so much higher. That's it. So if we want to have more wages, faster growing wages, we have to have a way that workers are more productive. That's just almost arithmetic. How do you get workers more productive? Better technology, we're talking about that all the time. Better equipment, better factories, more of those. And what this tax bill reform act does is reduce the tax on capital. It's not something that will generate only profits, it'll generate more income. Look what's happened already. There's huge bonuses that hundreds of firms are paying. Now people can say, oh, that's just showing how good they are. Well, they have to have money to do that. There's also reports of more investment already. It's quite amazing. And people like this. So I think it's important not to lose sight of what is trying to happen here. If you asked me again before this, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, how could we get wages growing in America more? I would say you've got to do with this have a very high tax on businesses that employ workers, that provide a better life for higher wages. So that's what's happened. That's why I think it's a positive. There's things on the personal side which we can talk about and debate. A lot of those have to do with states like California. But it's the huge increase in the standard deduction that helps a lot of people. It makes it much less complicated, $24,000. We're eliminating the state and local tax deduction in California. That's going to hurt a lot of us. It actually hurts the rich. Hurts the rich. And so think about that a little bit in terms of what's happening. And ultimately, I think it will benefit everybody. So maybe sound overly positive here, but the tone is in the other direction, and I think people need to think about that. So the reception in Davos that Lenny mentions, I think that surprised a lot of people, actually. Certainly surprised the press. And I think it's revealing something that is maybe a positive as well. The subject of Trump's speech this morning was America first, but it was America not alone. So he's trying to emphasize that we've got to do this together. So let's hope that happens. I'm a person interested in international affairs a lot, and I think we need to make sure our country moves in that direction. But who could not want faster growth? Who could not want more jobs for people? And what other way is there to do it than what's happened?
So we definitely need faster growth. That's what ultimately creates wealth and creates opportunity. But we could accelerate growth by not having it all go to the 1%. What we really need is not more inducement and tax benefits for capital. We need to ensure that labor is productive and the returns of that labor go to workers. That could have been done in this tax bill. What we should have done is said, we're going to give the opportunity for companies to bring their dollars back to the United States. But if you're going to bring your dollars back and get a big inducement, you're going to invest it in infrastructure. We need a lot of infrastructure in this country. That's what we should have done. We should have also paid for it by not further exacerbating this problem by giving a huge tax deduction to the wealthy. We had an opportunity to do tax reform right, and we did not. What we really need to be doing is not subsidizing capital. We need to be subsidizing labor. We need a huge investment in productivity in this country. The way that's going to come is from labor productivity. The way we get labor productivity is to invest more in labor, not keep throwing more capital at it. So we should have had an opportunity to invest in labor. The second thing I'd say on that is I actually believe we should not have had as substantial a tax deduction for home interest. But if you're going to do that, let's do it based on the cost of where you live. It costs $1.5 million to buy the medium home in San Francisco. It costs $187,000 in Kansas. So should we make the limit based on average, or should we adjust it for the cost of living? If you're trying to do it rationally, we should adjust it for the cost of living. If you're trying to do it politically to punish blue states on the coast, you do it the way we just did it.
So housing, how...
It's too expensive.
Could I get a little focus on what this is going to mean? And I think we'll need to factor in the likely direction of interest rates as well, which, John, your area of expertise. What do our listeners and viewers have to expect in the housing markets over the next year?
Well, first of all, interest rates are a big factor here, and we think the Fed will make some moves this year. 3 is what people talk about. That's the very short-term interest rate that they set. And that may carry over. I think it will carry over to other interest rates. So that is a negative in the sense of housing. But it's also a positive in the sense it rewards savers. You know, people always think a high interest rate can only be bad. Well, high interest rates are good if you have money to save, and you'll save more. So I think that's the other side of this, which it could be beneficial. I've been arguing probably the last time I spoke here that the Fed should have started moving earlier. And I think we'd have a little less risk in the financial markets if they had. But the good news is they've begun. And I think during their last year with Janet Yellen, a former president of San Francisco Fed, of course, she began a normalization. She began to raise interest rates, and they began to have a different type of dialogue about what they were doing. I thought it was quite good. She gave a speech here. In February. Next day she gave a speech at Stanford and talked about her strategy, which I thought was quite beneficial. So I think the Fed is moving in that direction. I hope it continues, but that's a positive sign for the economy, and I think ultimately for housing too.
So housing prices are driven by supply, demand, and interest rates mostly. Interest rates are going to go up, I agree, and they should. We should gradually raise interest rates to get the economy off of a massive monetary stimulus and let it grow at the right level that it can. The real problem with housing prices is the supply problem, particularly in high demand areas like where we are today. Average housing prices are meaningless across the country. They vary dramatically, as the anecdote that I told you. And the problem in California in particular is that we have built 1 million less homes in the last decade than job growth, 1 million. So if you think we're going to have a dramatic decline in housing prices in California on average, you have to believe that there's going to be a dramatic increase in the production of housing. I don't think that's going to happen. So interest rates are going to influence it, but we really have a problem of building enough housing for jobs in the parts of this country where they are.
Getting back to the policy environment, one of the most significant and enduring messages of the Trump candidacy had to do with a kind of a restoration or renewal of a kind of economic nationalism, casting doubts on the wisdom of NAFTA and other trade arrangements, casting tremendous skepticism about the value of immigration. And we're began to pick up pushback from our trade partners and from portions of the world that look to the United States for leadership and multilateralism in economic relations. And I'm wondering, what do you see happening? Is this nationalism, is that a correct characterization? Do you see it gaining more momentum? Is it beginning to have effects on the economy? And if so, where are you seeing that?
So what you hope for, at least what I hope for, is a global trading system where there's less impediments to trade, where there's less interference by governments to stop trade, have quotas, tariffs. They still exist all around the world. We've had improvements over the years under the GATT. But I think that's the direction you want to go. Now, the question is, how do you do that? And so, one, I've done trade negotiations. I know what the other people on the other side are doing. What you want to do is give them incentives to reduce their barriers if we reduce our barriers. And so I think that's what we're trying to do. It makes perfect sense for us to reduce our barriers. So the special actions on washing machines, that's not consistent with that. What you want to do, though, is say, hey, what about China? Are they opening their markets? Are they reducing their impediments to trade? And also other countries as well. So that's what I would hope would happen. And so we do, in a simple way, we do what's best for us, but they do what's best for them. And the economics suggests that will work just well. So you have to believe, first of all, you have to believe that it's good for your country to reduce your trade barriers. You have to be in that mode first, and it is. That's what economics tells you. And I think it's right for the most part. Maybe you can't do it too fast, but it's correct. That's why NAFTA has been very productive. We've reduced our trade barriers in all the countries. But it's even better if other countries do the same thing. So that's what I'd like to. That's the purpose of the GATT. That's the purpose of the reciprocal trade agreements. And we can do that if we stress, look, it's good for you, China, to reduce your trade barriers. You'll grow faster. It's better for your people. There'll be less income inequality. It's good for Rwanda to do the same thing, South Africa. It's good for Brazil. It's also good for America. So that's the notion I would like to stress.
So does this, what you're describing now, does that characterize a policy that's now in power? Does it policy that it replaces? I mean, have we seen it change?
Well,
or is it all rhetoric?
I think we're in a transition right now. The TPP is abandoned. There's real questions about North American Free Trade Area, NAFTA. So I think maybe take the example of NAFTA. So there are things that the Mexicans could do better. They realize that. The economists there realize that. So if they do those better, then you might have a better agreement. There's things we can do better. There's things that Canada can do better. I don't think it makes sense to drop out of this or make it invisible because it's been very productive. But it could be better. There are still barriers to trade in all these countries. We have fewer than Mexico, certainly. But they are still there, and we can be better off if they're lowered. Maybe it sounds too much like an economist speaking, free trade economist. I see a lot of nodding your heads, but that's okay. But it's one of the great ideas of economics that free trade basically works. It doesn't work every instant. It's like a new technology, and new technologies are great, but they are not comfortable for the person that loses their job because of the new technology. But we don't want to outlaw new technologies. That would be crazy. So you find ways for trade adjustment assistance. You have various other ways. And in this case, again, it's beneficial for the U.S. if other countries, especially the poorest countries, poor countries in Africa, if they do some things so their markets are more open to trade.
So you said you see policy as being in transition, and it's in a transition toward policies that you think are improvements on what preceded them. Is that right? I'm trying to.
Yes.
I'm trying to put you.
Absolutely, that's the hope.
Pin you down a little bit.
No, that's the hope. I think it's all our hope, right? To have isn't it? to have a better, more efficient international trading system. I think that's in all of our interests, certainly my interest. But you do that by giving the incentives to, as best you can, to each country do what's best for their citizens.
Well,
You have to look for what gets in the way of that.
What people like me who don't follow this
Yeah.
that carefully, or the people who are here watching us today, what they see is a series of lurches and blusters and denunciations
Yes.
that don't sound like leadership, like clear-headed leadership. What they sound like is sort of a succession of mini tantrums. And you're suggesting that there's actually wisdom here. There's actually the guile. There is a vision of what a good, strong, productive, mutually beneficial international regime looks like. And we are, in our own funny way, moving toward that in a way that we had not been moving toward it in the past.
Well, let me say, certainly hope so, and that's what I would strive for. There's, of course, there's a tendency for anybody to blame somebody else for your problems. So frequently we're not doing well because of Brazil, it's usually China, it used to be Japan, and blame them. That is not productive. I don't think that's productive, but it's popular. And so maybe that's what people think they're going to do to get elected or get their act through. But I think ultimately that's not going to help. Ultimately, what you do is actually have the change in a more productive direction. So international trade is very difficult to do. There's huge rhetoric on both sides. It's hard for me to get the simple ideas across, maybe even more difficult here. But it's very important to do that. And I think, I would hope, but we're going in the right direction, maybe not as in the way everyone would like, but stay involved. Keep at it in a productive way. I mean, in a productive way. That's what I would say to do.
So can I try another answer to that question?
Please.
The 45th person who currently occupies the White House has done two things constructive on this issue around America's place in the world. He has suggested that unfair trade barriers in other parts of the world are a bad thing, and he has suggested that we need a sensible immigration policy. Those are the last two positive things I will say about this current occupant's perspective and actions on these issues. We are in danger of not igniting a global trade war, which is a horrible, horrible thing. We need a different kind of global order for trade, but you don't do that by insulting the other people around the world. America's standing in the world, as just surveyed by the Trust Barometer, is lower than it's been since they started doing that, at the same time as trust in China has gone up. Do you think that's a good thing for the United States? Secondly, if we really want growth in the United States, we do have to have the productivity growth that we were talking about earlier. But because of demography, the United States working force population is getting lower. The way to deal with that is sensible immigration. We need immigration for the economy to grow. To blame Mexico for America's challenges is offensive. We need a policy for sensible immigration, including the dreamers who were here, as well as a longer-term goal towards immigration. You don't get there by insulting people. And finally, I am a huge believer in global trade. It has benefited the world. It has, in the last 2 decades, there have never been more people brought out of poverty, particularly in China, India, and Africa. It's incredibly helpful for the world. It has also benefited the United States in that time. The growth in the United States GDP is in large part driven by its connection to the rest of the economy. We need to do that. But every time an economist says that, they say, well, we can do trade adjustments for those who are disadvantaged, and they'll all be fine because the gains are not evenly distributed. Well, we do the first half of the sentence, and we don't do the second half of the sentence. We've advantaged globalism for the elite. We've not helped compensate those who are disadvantaged by it. Until people in Washington understand that you can't have globalization without ensuring that the losers are not damaged by this, you're going to have this kind of backlash. So what we need is sensible global trade regimes. We need a sensible immigration policy. And for those who are disadvantaged by those, we actually have to have policies that help them, not make it worse.
Let me ask you to stay on immigration. What do you see happening in the policy realm, and what consequences do you think it's going to have?
Do you want me to answer that one
Please.
first? The current occupant of the White House announced an important, that's what he is.
Well, it's not just an occupant, it actually lives there.
During the week, occasionally. By the way, as of this morning, I looked. The trading markets in the United States which are legal to wager on the likelihood that the current occupant of the White House will be impeached by the end of his first term are now at 40%. That doesn't mean he will be removed from office, and those are thinly traded markets, and I wouldn't put my Bitcoin on them. But it's an interesting statistic nevertheless. Just random anecdotes. So it's fact. I didn't make it up. It's real news. It's not fake news. So, sorry, what was your question again? Immigration, sorry. So we have now put on the table squarely the question about what should the United States immigration policy be. That's a very good idea. The deadline for February that the recent extension of the debt limits put to have a solution for dreamers is an important deadline, and we need to have a solution by then. Keep pushing this problem off and saying we're going to keep the country open, the economy, the budget open for another 30 days is terrible policy. So Congress needs to get together and solve that problem. I am skeptical in, what is that now, 14 days, that you'll have an integrated immigration solution that can get through both the Senate, but more importantly, the House. So I think what we should be doing is getting the Dreamers legal residency. There's close to agreement on that. And then set a path for a longer term, like 3 months, come back to Congress and say, a group of bipartisan cross-house people got together and said, we are going to produce a policy that has to be voted up or down by Congress, and the president has to sign it or veto it. Put a real solution on the table. Don't just keep putting it down the road.
So let me ask you to put on your economist hat, and why does immigration matter so much? What's at stake here in getting a coherent immigration policy, in economic terms, maybe?
Oh, America is built on immigration. That's where a lot of our ideas come from, especially here in this valley, in this community. So we don't want to get away from that. It's very important. So a sensible immigration policy is integral to our success as a country. I think it's very important to do that. And Lenny's suggestion, you have a package which you vote up and down, may be the way to go. I don't know. The President of the United States has come out with another proposal last couple of days. Some people don't like it. Some people like it. People on his right evidently don't like it. People on his left don't like it. So we'll see where that goes. But I think it's the shutdown was terrible. I mean, when are people going to wise up? Those things just don't work. I would like to see what I would call regular order. Regular order is the president would submit a budget, Congress would act on it, it would take place in the last quarter of the year and would be all set. That has disappeared from Washington. That's a much more certainty. It's more certain for the military, for other kinds of spending. But we're not there yet, and partly it's because there's incredible attacks on people. I mean, I have trouble doing that. Maybe that's my problem. I should attack people more often. But I think I can see why you might not like that. I don't like it either. But the question really to me is, how do we move forward in a positive direction? More jobs, higher wages, higher growth, more equal distribution, especially in the parts of the country that are doing terrible, parts of the Central Valley, but also parts of Ohio, Kentucky. J.D. Vance wrote eloquently about that in Hillbilly Elegy. We have problems in California. I give a statistic which comes from my colleague Rick Hanishek is an example of our problems. If you look at the math scores for 8th grade Hispanics in California, we rank 43rd in the country. If you look at the math scores for 8th grade Hispanics in Texas, also a border state, 2nd in the country. We're not doing the right thing. And let's focus on that. Let's focus on that. Those are real people who are not getting a good education And that's just a symbolic statistic. It occurs all over the place. And I want to deal with that. That's why I want higher growth. That's why I'm not going to complain about every last detail of this tax thing.
Well,
It's there, and that's it's
Can I respond
trying to
to that
make
before you-
things more
Yeah,
possible.
please, Larry.
So, first of all, don't start attacking people back. I'm serious. This really makes things.
Maybe we could go at it.
We can go at it, but we're going at it respectfully and not name calling. I think that's part of the problem about why these issues don't get resolved. If you actually put a sensible immigration policy in front of the United States citizens, 2/3 of people would agree with it. Our governing process today doesn't let that happen. That's the problem.
So if I interrupt for a second, so I get attacked a lot, as you do too. The most popular attacks of me are personal. If you want to get publicity, you give a personal attack. So by not going back in a personal direction, you get much less interest. It's just the way it is, and I think it's a problem. I agree with you entirely, but that's the reality. So face up to that, and I'm trying to do it in the right way, but it's hard. So think about that when you're reading things. Are you most interested in that personal attack, or are you interested in this in the weeds discussion of some technical topic? And most likely, people, oh, that personal attack's so much fun. See what he called that person? Isn't that terrible? See what the reaction was, and I think that's part of our dialogue. Maybe related to social media. Polarization, we don't know.
I think if you could resolve that, you'd be making a
So
major
can I add a
contribution.
suggestion about how we
health.
might be able to help resolve that? So I actually think you're exactly right on the social media is exacerbating this, and we need to deal with that. That's a topic for another terrific Commonwealth Club event. But what we need to do on issues of policy is help create an environment where good governing is good politics, as opposed the answer is you get elected by attacking your opponent or running to your bases. That's how we can get more sensible policies enacted, where those who are elected have the incentive to be problem solvers, not an incentive to win a primary and appeal to their base by attacking their opponent or meeting the needs of a very narrow portion of a primary.
I want to get you back onto economics for a moment. I have an interesting question from a member of the audience here having to do with growth. We have when we discuss, we put on our economics hats, we talk about the economy, how well it's functioning, how optimality, and we think that high growth is necessarily a very good thing. We are also living in a world in which recognition of resource constraints has deepened. We're all worried about running out of things. We're all worried about fouling our nest. We're worried about the same high growth rate that we worship and extol when we talk as economists. We realize it has serious consequences and serious impacts. And I'm wondering why where are we going with respect to sustainability? And are we moving? Are we continuing to move in the direction we need to be? Are we investing as we should be in renewables and in processes and in that enable us to make sure that we have a planet to bequeath to our young? And the audience wants that addressed, and it's something very much on our minds. There's no reason why a discussion of economics should exclude it.
So I just say a couple of things about that. One, I think people forget that if you have more growth, and it's an abstract concept in principle, you have more production of goods and services, so you can devote more to these problems. You know, the worst environmental disasters in the world were back in, say, Poland before they changed to a market system. I went there. It's unbelievably bad because they had no money to spend on it. So if you have more, if you're producing more, then you can produce things that are helpful to the environment. The other thing I would say is I agree completely that our lingo tends to be too abstract. Growth rate 3%, 4%. What does that really mean? And that's really been broadcast loud and clear to me in the last few years. When you're getting stories of people that are really hurting, and they're trying to articulate themselves politically, and they have people who are saying that their family's fallen apart, or they can't get a good education, the social services, that brings it home in a way that 3%, 2%, 2.6% cannot. And I think we as economists need to do more of that. I'd be so happy if we got 3% growth this year. But I need to say more about how that's going to help somebody in Ohio or the Central Valley.
So having faster growth and reducing the carbon intensity and extraction of resources are not antonyms. Done properly, they work together. Most of the rest of the world is trying to move in that direction. California is more aggressively moving that direction. The current policy of the United States is out of tune with what's going on there. California helped move this forward by saying, we want a fast growth economy, but we are going to set targets for carbon reduction, and we're going to hold everyone accountable for those, and it shall be the policy of the state of California, and it should be enacted in actions that ensure that that happens. California doesn't seem to have a growth problem. Why can't the United States do that? Now, I will also say that California is not just California. There are more than one Californian, so this needs to be done in a way that doesn't disadvantage Central California.
Right. Let's bear in mind that we have a national audience.
Right, I'm using it as an example. So it does, and those carbon policies for the United States need to be done in a way that doesn't just advantage New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, but it helps Ohio and West Virginia and Kansas as well. That can be done. There's actually a reasonably broadly agreed to set of statements signed by economists, many Republican economists who argued for a carbon tax in the United States. So if we put that into the equation and said, we're trying to grow, but we're also trying to ensure that the price of extraction is included in the costs, we can do both. California did it with cap and trade and a set of assumptions around what we needed to do to reduce carbon. The United States can do it by putting on a carbon tax if they had any political will.
We were talking earlier, and I'd like to get you to address for this audience inequality, how that affects what you see going, what trends you see, how the current economic policy and the tax bill will affect, either worsen or somehow ameliorate problems of long-term inequality. How are the blessings of this growth being shared, and are they being shared more? Is there impulses? Are there initiatives to see to it that they're being shared more equally?
So I think the data show that the inequality is sort of a pre-tax income. There's earnings that are much higher for certain groups, wealthy for pre-tax. So tax maybe has something to do with it, but it's a story that comes from the system, the market system. That's what the facts show to me. What you do about this is, first of all, there's lots of ways that people keep what they have. And if the system could be more open and more flexible. One thing, land use regulations are enormously restrictive for poor people. And there's huge differences in our country about land use regulations. California has one of the most restrictive land use laws in the country. And that may be part of the problem we see in different parts of the state. So it's a touchy subject, but let's face it, that could be a big part of what you do to inequality. The thing that seems to me more practical, and I'll just stress it again, and that is education. I just think it's tragic what's happening with especially K-12 in this country. I mean, aren't we terribly embarrassed about the performance of California versus Texas in the delivery of the system? Why don't we focus on that? Let's try to do something about it. Roll up our sleeves, get the best people involved. And this is the idea, I don't think, is too controversial to make education more equitable, more access to it, no matter where you live. But delivering that is very hard. That's where the idea is clear, but how do we put our hands around it and have a new session on that at the Commonwealth Club?
So I would love to have that session at the Commonwealth Club. It's the class that I teach it to business school students at Stanford, helping them think about what are business leaders' role in U.S. economic inequality. The first thing, just to give away the summary of the class in 30 seconds, one of them is, if you talk about it just as inequality, it creates concerns from a political standpoint. What we really should be talking about is economic mobility. Do you have a chance of advancing, and is that getting better or worse? The answer is it's getting worse, and a lot worse. Someone born when I was born I won't tell you, but a long time ago, had a 2/3 likelihood of having a better financial outcome than their parents. Today, it's a coin flip. And if you are in parts of the country where you are in poorer neighborhoods with less educated parents from disadvantaged populations, your chance of having economic mobility is incredibly low. That is not the American dream. We have to fix that problem. It is fixable. These are not laws of nature. There are human choices around how we design policy, what we choose to do. Housing, the issues around the ability to build more and do it in places that help give the next generation opportunities to own a home are an important part of that. Tax policies are incredibly important to that. The education policies are really important to that. So we just have to get serious about this. If we're going to assume that we're not going to have another democratic revolt, or much less something larger, when people are angry, it's because they don't look that mobility is not real for them. We can't just give lip service to it. We actually have to do something about it.
Let me ask you to talk a little bit about another of the administration's signature issues, which has been health care. I'm not sure I could tell you exactly where the push for health care change resides at the moment. It seems to have gone to sleep. I imagine it'll be awakened before long. And I'm wondering what you foresee and what consequences it will have and what you would like to see.
Do you want me to start? So there was not a concerted effort to health policy in the last discussion. It was about rolling back what was done before. What we need is a constructive conversation. And the reason that that failed was because Americans overwhelmingly support expansion of coverage. Everyone should be in the healthcare system and covered and insured that if there's a real consequence of a bad thing that happens to them, we all help with that. What we haven't done is find a way to ensure that we're doing that cost effectively. And so that's what needs to happen in the next wave of discussion about healthcare. It's not just about coverage. It's about health outcomes and ensuring that we're getting better value for our dollar. That's where the debate needs to go.
No, I agree with that entirely. I think that the idea of repeal, replace, where it hasn't worked in a particularly good way. Obviously, it's one of the lessons of being too partisan, I think. The original act came through and not everybody liked it, and so they finally came back and want to do something different. So I don't know where it's going to go. I just think, as Lenny was saying, you need to have a way to control the costs as you're providing more health care. I would think the simple things like buying insurance across state lines would help a lot, but there's lots of other things. Basically, the skin in the game, we call it sometimes, that the patient has some control over the costs. And sometimes, how could they know what's going on? But actually, people can be quite informed if they know what the money is being spent, and they can save some money by making different choices. So I think doing more of that would help as well.
The push toward deregulation, again, was a signature slogan in the political discourse. What have we gotten so far? What are we likely to get? And what consequence is that likely to have?
Well, I think this is a second area where there's been really a big change with this new administration to deal with regulation. So the appointments have generally been, well, let's try to find a way to make, I would call it cost-benefit analysis apply more specifically. The various appointments have been in that direction. The person who's in charge of regulation, OMB, Naomi Rao, I respect her quite a bit. She has great ideas of how to make this whole system work sensibly. So OMB is in Office of Management and Budget, where a lot of this can take place.
If I could just interrupt you, you're
Sorry.
being very charitable. You're giving them credit for actually approaching these challenges in a very methodical way. Much of the media depiction suggests people who are simply taking office and not enforcing existing laws. And they call that deregulation.
Well, not enforcing existing laws, I think. I mean, the OMB director just had a piece in the Wall Street Journal. Mick Mulvaney says, "I will enforce the law." Rule of law is extraordinarily important. So I'm not questioning. If anybody's going in the other direction there, we're going in the wrong direction. The rule of law is what is so important for this country. Is one of the things I hold up as very important from an economic policy.
But I'm certainly environmental
enforcement.
the impression environmental enforcement is that the laws, where there's enormous discretion as to which laws are going to be applied and how zealously, and they've simply chosen not to enforce the laws.
I would say and you have to give me specific examples. What I would say, it's an attitude that you're not going to have regulations where the costs exceed the benefits. And that is the principle. Yes, there's lots of criticism. Like, gosh, I mean, this is, if you say you don't have to report, a small bank doesn't have to report as much as a big bank. Oh my gosh, that's a terrible relaxation of regulations. But a small bank can't possibly do what a big bank can. So that's a sensible application of financial regulations, which I think makes sense, and we should be looking for more ways to do this. So regulation, it may be the most important thing to do, and I'd say more sensible regulation is the way to do it. You have ways that we can apply this, whether it's the environment, whether it's to electricity regulation, whatever it happens to be. And it seems to me it's a change in the right direction, not in every single thing. It's thousands of acts and laws we're talking about, but if you think it's just not enforcing the law, I don't think that's correct at all. It's finding a way to make the law more effective in its purpose, which is to restrict externalities caused by environmental pollution or many, many other things.
So the problem isn't the OMB. We should put economists in charge and everything would be fine. The problem is the regulatory agencies. And I'll give you two concrete examples of where they are not enforcing policies that were enacted by Congress. The EPA is not enforcing the Clean Air Act, and they are not allowing California to proceed on what was already agreed to in terms of having a waiver to do what we think makes sense here. They will lose those cases in court, and they should. That's inappropriate. Secondly, the Federal Communications Commission, particularly its chairman, who is in the pocket of a particular industry interested in this topic, has concluded that net neutrality was actually not the policy of the United States and unilaterally changed that. Those are not things that are supposed to be done unilaterally by a regulatory agency. They're supposed to have a transparent rulemaking process that is open to the public, that you understand what goes on, that reflects the will of the legislation that was passed through democratic purposes. That cannot happen. Thank goodness we have courts.
Let me get you to talk a little bit about the tech sector. It's awfully important as a driver of the economy. Over the last year or so, there's been, one senses, a rather profound change in public perception of the tech sector, from being a source of unending miracles to being a sort of broadly malevolent and overstuffed and too rich and too rapacious and out to do wrong. And I'm wondering whether there is this change in the public perception. Does it have policy consequence? Does it have economic consequence? Are there activities that the tech sector is going to be prevented from doing? Is it going to feed prosperity and growth? I just wonder what your outlook is and whether you think there's going to be laws or regulatory responses to tech that are going to reflect some of this public disquiet.
Do you want me to start on that one?
Please.
I think it's very important to keep the innovations coming, to stress their advantages. Globally, it makes a big difference that a poor person in Africa can learn how to do a skill by social media they couldn't possibly do. The values are just enormous. There are the negatives, the polarization we talked about, the lack of transparency and how things are controlled at a particular firm. But I think what I would like to do is not to shut down the enormous benefits from this as people look at these issues. So it is a regulatory issue. And here it seems to me there may be great sympathy for more sensible regulations coming from the high-tech community, say in Silicon Valley or wherever you're talking about. They have huge interest in getting the regulations right in cost-benefit. And now, if fintech is a really example, it's kind of hard to do fintech with all these regulatory apparatus that's in place. So there's this commonality of interest that I think will be beneficial for the high-tech community to be sympathetic with this, I'll call it more sensible regulation than we have now.
But what sorts of things would you regulate? Would you like to see them regulate?
Well, risk in the financial area is risk-taking, so restrictions on what banks have, the capital requirements, those kinds of things.
Oh, I thought we were on tech here.
Well, I meant fintech, the new technology of financial innovation, which there's lots of compliance that has to be taken into account by the firms, whatever they're doing. And so that could be done in a way that reflects the new technology nobody's been able to use before. So that's what I mean in the financial area.
So my answer to your questions around is tech going to advance and create opportunity? Is there going to be a backlash against it? Will it affect regulation and laws? Is the public sentiment going to influence all that? Yes. So the answer is yes.
You feel free to elaborate.
And that's why I will agree with Dr. Taylor on this, which is that the tech industry needs to engage in a way to ensure that there is sensible regulation for what they're attempting to do. Playing regulatory arbitrage by saying, I'm going to just violate the regulations, and if you catch me, go ahead, is not a business model. The technology industry needs to assume that they have responsibility for what they're doing, or someone else is going to assume that for them. And I think that's completely doable, actually. What's happened is the tech industry, particularly the newer elements of that in this part of the world, have gone from a small company established by a very young man, mostly, unfortunately, to something that is a global entity with important implications. That's like putting teenagers in charge of your savings. That's probably not a very good idea. So we need to help them understand that you are now an adult. You're not a baby, you're not a teenager. Behave like one.
I'm sure a number of people in our audience are very curious about the stock market. We have retirements that depend upon its continued health. It is going gangbusters. What's going on? Have we got a bubble? Is something going to drive over a cliff? How long is this likely to be sustained? And what's driving it?
Good question. So as you might note from my previous comments, I think we've seen a change in policy which is beneficial to the stock market, and that largely has to do with taxes and regulation. It's not rocket science to say that those are beneficial to firms. The debate is how beneficial they'll be to everybody else, which I think it will be. But there are also other unusual circumstances. The very low interest rates we've had in the US, the globally negative interest rates in Europe and Japan. So it's an unusual circumstance, and it is very hard to determine the impact of that, through whether it's on housing markets, whether it's on the stock market. But I would just say, maybe to just emphasize, there are some things that are changing, and those would be things that benefit stocks, and we just hope that there's not something else under the scenes that could break that apart.
If I knew the direction the stock market was going to go, I'd be making a fortune as a Bitcoin trader, and I'm going to do neither.
Oh, well, are you in the market?
I have a dedicated portion of my net worth in long-term oriented market-sensitive assets, and I don't trade on them.
Ah.
It's a fact. I'm just telling you what I do. That's true.
So you're not resistant to the idea that we'll see the Dow at 30,000?
In my children's lifetime? No, I think it's there is a logic to describe the market. It still has room to grow. There is logic that it's overvalued. That's really fundamentally dependent on the set of things that we were talking about earlier. What happens to the growth implications of what's going on, and what happens to interest rates. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and that's why it's hard to predict.
I have a question from the audience about the deficit, as in whatever happened to the deficit as a matter of policy concern.
The deficit is getting worse. It's 666 in the most recent year. It was under 500 2 years ago. It's getting worse. And quite frankly, it's largely because spending continues to grow. The tax reform is frequently mentioned as a factor in the deficit. But I think that misses the fact that we had projected tax revenues to rise a bit as a share of GDP. The numbers are from 78% this year to, 17.8% of GDP to 18.2. The tax reform, tax bill, tax act, keeps it at 17.8. So it's not really like a tax, doesn't change the deficit in that sense. The main problem is spending, and you're right, we're not doing that. And there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about for the debt. It's the hardest thing to deal with. Maybe that now that the tax reform is behind us, we'll try to tackle that. But it's probably more controversial than anything else. But it's one of my four things is the budget reform, which we haven't done yet.
The deficit is bad. It's getting worse. It is going to get worse as a result of the tax changes, unless you believe the outlier assumptions about economic growth, which is, by the way, not what the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office said. So we are going to have to deal with longer-term deficit issues. And we're going to have to deal with that by both ensuring that the economy grows in a sustainable way, because that we can't solve the deficit problem by cutting our way out of it or raising taxes alone. And then we do have to deal with issues that are the largest growth in the budget, which are healthcare expenditures. I don't think of those as entitlements. I think that of living up to promises that we've made to future generations. We need to do that responsibly, and the issue is how do we ensure growth in the economy and how do we rein in healthcare expenses?
So, in light of concerns over the deficit, would you expect to see the infrastructure spending plans that were talked about during the campaign, would you expect to see them revived? We're going to see the kind of federal commitment to infrastructure renovation that we heard about?
So I'm very concerned about the deficit. So whatever we do in these accounts, I want to make sure the deficit doesn't get worse and gets better. So infrastructure, there's private public partnerships that are being discussed. There's other things to do it, but let's just not think that we're going to raise our deficit without any concern. That's a mistake. Infrastructure is definitely a problem. Find ways to finance it, but in the meantime, try to deal with the spending problem as a whole.
Is it your feeling that the tax changes are deficit neutral?
In the sense, as I said, the tax revenues as a share of GDP are being held constant effectively. Tax revenues as a share of GDP are not falling compared to what the projection was.
So we're on the infrastructure question, we are not going to see a substantial federal investment in infrastructure, partly for the reason that Dr. Taylor said, but partly because we missed the opportunity in tax reform to use that as a basis to invest in infrastructure. What's going to happen is that there will be an announcement that this $1 trillion plan to invest in infrastructure. There will be no change in federal government spending, and it will be private investment in that. That's not the same thing.
That'll have to be our last word today. I want to thank John Taylor and Lenny Mendonca, and thank you here, the Commonwealth Club. And with that, it's my pleasure to bring this session of the Commonwealth Club to a close.
Thank you. Great seeing you. That was fun.